Hi, welcome again to this virtual space. Today we are going to be talking about Erik Erikson. Um, I actually found, this is a sidebar, personal opinion, I have actually found Erik Erikson's theory to be quite useful in my practice and working with individuals, not just in the counseling setting, but also in the school setting. So I'm hoping that this will be an interesting presentation for you and that you can gain some greater knowledge that could be helpful for you if you are in the field of education, counseling, psychology, or just to learn more about yourself. As I begin with each theorist, I think that it's important to highlight the theorist's family of origin, childhood, background, because it gives you kind of like a picture or a window into who they were as a person, and then you can kind of see some of that remnants in the theory that they developed. So with Erik Erikson, his mother gave birth to him out of wedlock. He was raised by his stepfather, and so from that he suffered from abandonment and identity crisis, which you'll see as we go through his theory. He's formulated an opinion or a theory about that. And so because of this upbringing, he wandered in a quest for identity, searching for who he was. So psychosocial stages of personality development is based off of this principle. I'm not sure if you are familiar with epigenetics. If you are not, I encourage you to look it up and learn more about it. I'm just going to briefly define epigenetics as basically the neuroscience behind behavior. And the neuroscience behind behavior is that our upbringing, our surroundings, which would be considered, when we talk about nature versus nurture, it would be the nurturing, the community, the nurturing part that we are raised around, has a direct impact on our nature. And when we are referring to nature, we are talking about biological, our genetics. And so epigenetics principle states that. And so with psychosocial stages of personality development, this plays out. It plays out if your nurturing was harmful and unhealthy, and how that plays out into your biological genetics, and vice versa if it was healthy, and how that plays out. Now, there's also the theory that there are crises that you will encounter at every stage of development. And this, going back to the epigenetics, if you come from a harmful nurturing background that impacted your nature, your biology, then when you come in contact with these crises, you're unable to handle them. Now, sidebar, when we talk about epigenetics, I think that it's important to keep in mind multicultural, I'm trying to think of the word I wanted to use, but multicultural viewpoint, because when we talk about spirituality, in particular African spirituality or indigenous spirituality, this is not something that is stagnant. This is something that, I don't want to say curable is probably not the right word, but healing can take place. I think that's a better word. Healing can take place. And this theory about how the environment around you can impact your biology has been around before the psychosocial stages of personality development, before what we know as the term psychology. Again, if you visit my presentation, I think it's called The Global Overview, I believe is the title I gave it. I kind of talk a little bit more about that, about how a lot of these concepts that are taught in psychology today have been around for ages, from the Eastern philosophy and from the indigenous and African people. And now there's just different terms that are being used for it. Okay, so Erik's stages of psychosocial development. I think that this was something I got from Very Well, so credit to Very Well website. I thought they did a very good job of presenting a chart that kind of describes or visually describes Erik's stages of psychosocial development. So I'm not going to go over it on this slide because we're going to go a little bit more in depth in the upcoming slides. But I just think that this does a very good job of depicting like the life cycle that one goes through. So this is just another overview of Erik's stages of psychosocial development. And again, we're going to break down each stage. And you can find different charts on Erik's stages of development for free online. Just Google his title, Erik's stages of psychosocial development, and put in PDF, and you can find several options. I prefer the ones that give the information about the adaptive and maladaptive. And what I mean by that is adaptive is when we were talking about the nature versus nurture with epigenetics, when you are raised in an environment that teaches you that is healthy, then you develop healthy adaptive ways of coping through those crises that we were talking about, right? That everyone encounters through stages of development. And the maladaptive would be an unhealthy or unhelpful way of coping through those crises. And just to give an example of a crisis, I'm going to do one for the oral sensory from birth to 1 year old, because sometimes when we think about crisis, we can go to the extreme with that thought. But a crisis, for example, for this stage of development would be learning how to walk, right? And the falling down, and the bumping the little knees. And so that could be a crisis. And if, for example, bringing in epigenetics, if, for example, when you are going through that stage of development where you are learning how to walk, if when you fell, it was laughed at, let's say like the parents laughed around you or your caregivers laughed, or there was not anyone to care for you or tend to you when you fell, and let's say you cried, then you're beginning to formulate a concept on the world around you, right? From that. Versus if you were around 1 year old and you're learning how to walk and you fell, and the parent came to you and was like, oh, you were doing a good job, you'll get it. That would be a different, so then now I am encouraged through trying, right? And it's a different way that I was soothed. So that would be an example of a crisis from oral to sensory, the birth to 1 year old. And so if I have been surrounded by a helpful environment, then I am learning how to trust. With that same example, like I am learning how to trust myself, right? Like, oh, look at me, I'm walking. versus the latter would be a mistrust. And so the strength that you are building during this time is hope. Now, we're about to break down each stage of development. But before we begin, I want to reiterate this global overview, right, and how this concept of development, our identity, which is so in the Western society, so heavily focused on the European, predominantly white male's point of view. I think that it's important to keep in mind the multicultural considerations, right? And that these concepts have been around for ages with different points of view on them that are different from the theories that you are learning about today. So I just think that that's important to keep in mind because, for example, with the oral and sensory example that I just gave versus trust and mistrust and how the strength is hope, one might say that one must encounter trust and mistrust to get to hope. You know, that could be a point of view from an Eastern philosophy way, like they both are needed, that it's learning the balance between the two is important. So again, it's just important when you talk about psychology that multicultural considerations are always taken into consideration and looked at. All right, so trust versus mistrust, infancy to first year. Outward signs of healthy growth, if the needs are being met and the infant is developing a sense of basic trust, some of the things that would happen is an investment in relationships, lets mother go, like, for an example, you know, if they are learning how to walk again, it's just such an easy example to use. Letting go of mommy's hand and wobbling on their own. Welcomes touching. I don't know if you've ever encountered like those babies that are like, stay away from me, stay away from me, stay away from me type of thing. You know, that's saying, I don't trust, I don't trust, I don't trust. And so like the welcoming, touching, good eye contact, shares self and possessions. So these are just some examples of indicators that an infant is forming a healthy expression of trust. Now, also, I think it's important, sidebar, as I am bringing in the multicultural consideration, which you will find that I will do that often coming from my background of being an African-American female. So you will hear me reiterate that often. Plus, not just that, but I am firmly allied. I think that was said the wrong word. Allied with the BIPOC community, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I think, and what that means is that I am intentional about knowing the history of people of color, understanding the history, aware of my own biases from the history, and skills in working with the population. So that's what I mean by allied. And so the sidebar that I was going to say is that, you know, when we talk about multicultural considerations, if you come from certain backgrounds, you don't do eye contact, right? So if that's the community you come around, that you grow up around, then you as a child, infancy, the first year of life, may not have that as well, right? And so I think that what's important when we're talking about, or we're going through these stages of development, and again, reiterating that this is a theory from a theorist on what's happening in each stage of development, right? There are many theories out there, that one must trust their gut, right? Like one must take culture into consideration before you are determining if an infant to 1 year old, that stage of development, is not forming a healthy form of trust. Okay, so some expressions of mistrust would be avoids relationships, suspicious, closed, guarded, unwilling to let mother go, loner, unhappy, poor eye contact, does not share self or possessions. So these would be some examples of a child or an infant to first year of life that they are not forming a healthy form of trust. Now, again, sidebar, when you think about, in particular, the African American community, and we talk about racial trauma, which stems from historical oppression, right, and violence that has been placed on us from slavery, Jim Crow, and even into today, like, a child could naturally pick up on that in the home, that, it is to be mindful of who you trust or to be suspicious. Like, these are some ethnicity characteristics of people of color because of the historical reference. So again, you have to make sure that you keep these things in mind when you are learning about these stages of development. Okay, so autonomy versus doubt and shame. So this is toddler to second year. And so at this stage of development, a toddler strives to learn independence and self-confidence. And I think that when, I'm just going to go back for a second. Oh, I just realized it does not allow me to go back. Okay, well, I was going to say, I think that what's the main thing that's important is the overall theme of what the child should be developing, and then matching that to the culture considerations, right, and how that looks for that culture. And so speaking about the toddler to second year, like, this is the goal for the toddler to strive to be independent and self-confidence. According to Erik Erikson's theory, this is expressed, or these are some of the examples of if a toddler is developing this, is not easily led, resists being dominant, able to stand on their own 2 feet, works well alone or with others, and assertive when necessary. Now, when this is not happening, there is an expression of shame and doubt, and some of the characteristics, according to Erikson's theory, is that they would procrastinate, have trouble walking alone, need structure and direction, has trouble making decisions, is easily influenced and embarrassed when complimented. All right, so the next stage is 3 to 5 years, preschooler to 5 year, which is the kindergarten typically, is an initiative versus guilt. And preschoolers learn to initiate tasks and grapples with self-control. And so at this stage of development, what you should be seeing is a preschooler or kindergarten who is able to self-regulate. And what self-regulate means is they're able to, that's appropriate for their age and in the setting. So self-regulate emotionally. An example of that may be if in kindergarten your teacher is passing out the snacks, right? And you should be able to, actually we'll use that to talk about emotional regulation and just self-control regulation as well. And you're waiting for your turn. And so emotional regulate would be being able to, even though you're hungry and you're ready for the snack, right, that you are not going to have an anger outburst or a temper tantrum or excessively crying because you haven't received the snack immediately. And then the self-control part of regulate is, and so I'm not going to take my classmates that's sitting next to me. I'm not going to take their snacks because I'm ready to eat. So that would be an example of that. And so when self-regulation is not developing properly in this age range, some of the things that you may see is low energy, puts self down, gets depressed easily, slumped posture, poor eye contact. These could be some of the characteristics. Again, I can't help but continue to reiterate that multicultural considerations must be taken into, thought about when looking at theories that talk about identity and personality, which is what we have been talking about in the presentations that I have been giving. All right, so the next stage is competency versus inferiority. This is elementary age students up until puberty. So that's about 12, 13 years old. And the overall goal for this stage of development is children leans either to feel effective or inadequate. There should be curiosity, right? At this stage, they should be curious about the world around them and asking questions about that. And the world around them from a culture standpoint and the world around them as far as a nature standpoint as well. Some characteristics, if at this stage that is not developing properly, the child may be timid and somewhat withdrawn, overly obedient, procrastinates often, an observer, not a producer, and questions own ability. Okay, so identity versus role confusion, adolescence to teen years. This is probably the most popular stage of Erik Erikson's development. It's the one that you probably hear about the most and see examples about the most. And I think it's because, adolescents are at that age where they are the most vocal about it. And I think there's more movies and social media that talks about it. And so at this stage, basically, teenagers are learning who they are. They're formulating an opinion about who they are, right? They're knowing self. They're learning self, learning their values, and learning their purpose. And so that is a bumpy journey. And I might add that some of us are still learning who we are, right? And our values and our purpose. And so during this stage of development, everything is questioned, everything is explored, everything is challenged, because that is how we learn and grow, and identify what our likes and dislikes, what our values are, and just how we want to experience the world around us. I think that this little clip is such a good example of this stage of development. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the Prom. It came out in 2020 on Netflix, and this clip shows when Alyssa comes out because her mom had strong conservative right-wing opinions about the LGBTQ community. So I wasn't going to show the video, but it's something that you can look up on your own. So if adolescence is struggling through this stage of development, right, then some of the things that you may see is overly obedient or overly hostile. And this is where we talk about external versus internal ways of dealing with frustration. So internally, being overly obedient, like I'm taking it in, versus externally being overly hostile is like I'm letting it out. These are pretty good telltale signs if an adolescent is struggling through this stage. Is the external versus internal that I was just mentioning, which also could be termed maybe anxiety symptoms versus anxiety and depressive symptoms versus behavior problems, that like acting out behavior problems, and also the lack of confidence would be another telltale sign. I wanted to mention also about the doubt about their gender identity or sexual identity. And I think that is another one when we talk about multicultural considerations, is considering the LGBTQ community and how, so because Western society is based on a Christian religion, and Christian religion has different ideals about the LGBT community. It can be very difficult for an adolescent who's coming of age and formulating their ideal of self, right? To be true to what their spirit is saying to them. And so again, this is a sidebar, this is an opinion. I think that is something that would be a natural part of that stage of development of owning your identity. I think that those doubts may come in because of just the world that we live around. And so I would just encourage for those of us who work with adolescents, or if you just know of someone, or you yourself are going through it, that to stay encouraged, to surround yourself with allies, because you know who you are. You know who you are. Celebrate who you are. Be proud of who you are. We come in all shades and colors and different gender expressions, and don't allow a society's way of thinking on something to cause you to question who you are coming to be. So I just wanted to throw in that sidebar. Okay, so the next stage of development is middle adulthood to 60 years. And basically this stage of development is when you've gone through this stage, quote unquote, right? Like you know who you are. And now you are living a life that embodies that. And that's basically what a healthy sign of this stage of development. And if you are not, then, if you're still not able to own completely who you are and fully embody that in the way that you interact with the world around you, there may be resentment, obesity, you may withdraw, dissatisfaction with life and your job, complaining and blaming, and just stagnant. This is why so often you may hear about like the midlife crisis. So often you may hear at this stage of development where a couple has been married. Let's say they got married when they were really young. So let's say they got married at, 25, and then you hear like at 50 that they're getting a divorce, and you're like, what happened? And it's because they're coming out. They're finally coming of age. Kind of like, I think Caitlyn Jenner would be an example of that, right? Like, she finally came out and just fully embodied who she was. So again, sometimes we're not always able to perfectly fit in these boxes of stages of development, right? Like sometimes it may take longer, or sometimes it may come earlier. And so the last stage of development is late adulthood. And this is the stage where if you have been able to, and maybe not have been able to go through it, like I was just saying, in those timelines, but you were able to go through them, right? Then you're able to come to this stage of life and reflect on life and feel a sense of satisfaction and purpose and value. But if you have not, then you may be struggling with despair and deep resentment because of the life choices that were made, low self-esteem, angry at yourself and at others in the world and society. So as I've been saying throughout, multicultural considerations have to be looked at. When we talk about multicultural considerations, we're talking about ethnicity, racial trauma, culture, like all of these things, these factors must be looked at when you're talking about identity. So Erik Erikson's questions about human nature, he believed it was free will and that you could determine how your life would look. Nature and I'm sorry, I did a typo. I did nurture and nurture. It should have been nature and nurture, are heavily influenced on you each stage of development, focused on the past and the present. He believed that you are a unique you, but then you also are a collective you, universality you. That growth happens throughout life, and he had an optimistic view about human nature. Some assessments that Erikson theory utilizes is play therapy and observing through the child's play, and the psychohistorical analysis, where you basically have the client provide like a historical view of their lifespan, and it's compared are analyzed from the chart or the stages of development. Some research on Erikson's ideals. Some research has shown that people of ethnic minorities who score high in ethnic and racial identity tend to score high in subjective and well-being and self-esteem. So basically what he's saying, what the research has shown, that people who have a strong sense of their ethnic and racial identity, those stages that we were just talking about or we went through, tend to score high in those areas. Gender preference research has shown that Black and Hispanic children feel great pressure to conform to gender roles, and conflicts over gender preference are related to low self-esteem, guilt, and stress. Those high in gay identity show high self-esteem and no desire to change. And so basically, kind of similar to what I was saying before, if you are raised in a community that embraces how you are developing and coming into be, then you have less doubt and less and confusion about who you are, what you're learning about yourself, versus communities that tend to challenge gender identity, or maybe not challenge, that's not the right word. I would say more so of conservative in their thinking of it, and so they tend to lean more towards a majority. And I mean say majority because I don't feel like it's the majority. I'll just say conservative, leans towards more of a conservative view on gender, and sticks to more of these traditional boxes. Then, of course, when you are learning, coming to be, right, and coming into your full self, there could be some confusion or some doubt or just some pressures, right? Because as you are learning who you are, you may be realizing that I don't fit into these gender norms and I feel like I'm leaning towards something else, like say non-binary. And so, of course, if you come from a community where that is not welcomed and received, it can be a challenge for you. Research on ego identity. Some of the research has shown that establishing a virtual identity online allows you to try on different identities, and formation of ego. I'm not reading through them all. I'm kind of just highlighting a few of the pointers. Formation of ego identity in women is more influenced. His research on his ego identity theory has shown that is more influenced by career concerns and is linked to the willingness to change. People high in generativity. This is where we were talking about if you have come to that late stage, not late stage, the middle age stage of development, and you have already gone through the identity versus role confusion, and you went through that and you're fully yourself, then people tend to be more happy and satisfied with their life. People high in ego integrity spend quality time examining their past, can acknowledge regrets and missed opportunities, and have few feelings of bitterness and resentment. A lot of research has been done on Erik Erikson's theory, and so of course there's been research on childhood and adolescence, and basically I'm not going to read through the research because I'm looking at the time, and this presentation is taken rather longer than my previous ones. But it's just so much information on Erik Erikson's theory, and there's just so many multicultural considerations that must be taken into consideration as well. So the research on childhood and adolescence has basically shown some validity to the theory on the stages. And what I mean by that is that when a child or adolescent comes from when a child or adolescent is interviewed, right, and it is realized that they come from, let's say, a healthy environment and where they were nurtured to become an independent, well-rounded, proud to be who you are person, it correlated with the examples that we went through, that Erikson's theory shares of how it would look in your stages of development. So hopefully that makes sense what I'm saying. Some reflections on Erikson's theory. Personality develops through lifespan. Concept of identity crisis in adolescence. Recognition of culture, social, and historical influences. And inspired the field of lifespan development psychology, and also plays a significant role in helping to analyze play therapy. Some criticisms on Erikson's theory is incomplete description of maturity, Erikson's position on sex differences, stages may not be applicable for women, people in reduced economic circumstances. So let's critique. Do you agree or disagree with Erikson's identity theory? Why or why not? Are there some parts you agree with? If so, what are they? Would you use the theory in a counseling session? Why or why not? And if so, how would you use it? Again, I think it's important as we look at the different theorists and their theories on personality to keep in mind your theory. You should be formulating your theory on personality right, in development. And your theory is going to come from your family of origin and your upbringing, your community, and what you have encountered and how you have experienced the world thus far. And so I would think that living in the 21st century, learning about these different theorists, you are probably picking and choosing what gravitates to you more. And so I think it's important to critique the theorists and critique them from a lens of what speaks to you, what doesn't speak to you, and having a clear understanding of that. So I thank you for your attention. I apologize for this presentation being a little bit more lengthier than the others. There was a lot of information to cover.